Warm welcome today to Galia. She's the co-founder of Bancor. It's one of the leading DeFi platforms and pioneers in the blockchain space. She's a huge inspiration and an expert in lots of different fields, from like community currencies to the future of value, and part of this whole revolution in blockchain and tokens, I think, has been inspired and emerged from her work at Bancor. So yeah, please put your hands together and welcome Galia.
Thanks so much, Michael. I tend to not think of myself as an expert in anything, but certainly I've tried a lot of stuff. But thank you for the warm introduction and for the opportunity to share. Why don't you help us get started with how you'd like to unfold the conversation today?
Most definitely. So love to hear, Galia, like in terms of your story, in terms of like how did you get started? Why is the blockchain so interesting? Like how did Bancor come about, and like what's your vision for the space? So yeah, maybe if you can start with maybe your story, please.
So start at the beginning and go all the way to the future. I was born in California, in Palo Alto. I'm a Silicon Valley native, so maybe that's kind of where the story starts in a way, that I just have been immersed in the technology ecosystem and kind of the entrepreneurial environment from a young age. But I'll skip sort of the first 25 years or so to where I got my start in high tech after college and in tech startups. Built a bunch of mostly consumer-facing mobile applications in a time where smartphones were just getting off the ground, or they were becoming smart. So this is circa 2004, 2005. So that's sort of the startup and the tech background. But where it really started to intersect with what I work on today in blockchain is when I went to graduate school. So I did a graduate program through Johns Hopkins called SICE, which is an international relations program. I grew up as a first generation American to Israeli parents. I was always very interested in international relations and kind of why can't we all just get along kind of thing. So I went to study international relations in 2008, 9, 10. And this program, just by chance, asks you to double major in international economics. Not by chance, it's actually fundamental to how they see international relations. And so I found myself doing a degree in international economics and really starting, with Econ 101 all the way up to global monetary theory, which was a topic I never cared for at all. I really avoided it in college. It seemed like just not for me, very quantitative. Not for me, avoided it. And then kind of was faced with it in grad school. And those years, 2008, 9, and 10 were really interesting because the entire kind of global financial apparatus was falling apart in front of our eyes. And so you had American professors of economics, the greatest, that we have or that we know, pointing fingers at Europe, and you had the European professors pointing fingers at America. This was the financial crisis, which then also led into the Euro crisis when Greece started to have challenges in the Euro monetary agreement. And I, as a student that was sort of a window shopper to this topic, was baffled by a system that works like this or doesn't work like this. And it became very clear to me, or at least the insight was, this economic system is designed by people. It's not ordained. It's an idea. It's a compilation of ideas that have developed over time. And the following insight was it can be redesigned by people. We could redesign it to make it work better. We could have currencies that aren't volatile in this way. We could have monetary policies that aren't political. We could have a system with a different orientation and then a different outcome. And when I came back to Silicon Valley in 2010, to Palo Alto, where I'm from, my engineers and the teams that I had worked with in my startups were all kind of from a different angle discovering Bitcoin in the forums, very early days. And for me, that was the like the aha moment was sort of this big problem and an idea of a solution, which is that people could redesign the system, and then that technology could really be our partner in that. And that was when I became fascinated with Bitcoin, and Bitcoin very quickly led to other coins. We have all kinds of fun names for them now, but at the time we called Bitcoin a user-generated currency. And that came from our background in consumer internet, where we looked at, user-generated video, user-generated content, user-generated forums, user-generated groups. Sort of the whole consumer internet movement, from my perspective or my exposure to it, was about user-generated anything. And so Bitcoin was, from our perspective, the first user-generated currency. And what we had learned in our time in consumer internet, at least, is that when you have one consumer user-generated something, you'll eventually have millions of them, of whatever that is. So, you don't get one video on YouTube, you get hundreds of millions. You don't get one forum, you get hundreds of millions. And so we were very inspired by kind of what the future of user-generated currency would look like, and what the software layer or the tools that folks would need to navigate that world would look like, and what we could build that would be useful and would be helpful. So in 2012, we started, my co-founders and I got back together and started a company specifically focused on letting people generate their own currencies for their groups. And it's kind of mind-bending, as you said, Yip, to think about that now in 2021. It's still super hard to do. And this was 2012, there was no narrative around these topics. But we actually, interestingly, took a really different approach maybe than what has been tried in the years since, which is we actually launched currencies on the ground into communities. So we didn't, launch a token. We didn't even build on blockchain. We actually ran pilots essentially with different user groups, with custom currencies that were made just for that group, and focused on the user experience side of things. So kind of what is the app or the interface that a user would need in order to successfully receive a currency, in order to successfully understand its use, and then in order to use it in real commerce. And between 2012 and 2016, we ran dozens of pilots with dozens of groups. The most kind of successful, or the largest of those pilots was a project called Mama Zone, which I've spoken about at various times, that had a currency called Hearts. And this was a currency for families, essentially, and very much driven by mothers. And it became a marketplace, and a very vibrant one at that. And through that experience, we learned so much about what currency actually is, like what it means to a person, what it means to a group, to have these budgets, if you will, and to use them locally. And then we also understood kind of the big elephant in the room, if you will, which became Bancor, which was that without liquidity, without kind of a seamless, frictionless, permissionless liquidity infrastructure, any one of these currencies could kind of thrive momentarily, but ultimately would plateau and then decline. And there's a very kind of economic reason for that, which is that certainly in modern times, we no longer live in kind of a siloed economic world. Sure, there are many economic transactions, and even like an abundance of our economic transactions happen locally and happen within particular subgroups. But the moment you start looking at our full economic activity and you see things like smartphones or vehicles or fuel or energy, some of the bigger ticket items, if you will, those require collaboration between groups. No group can make an iPhone without kind of collaborating with other groups. No group can build a car without collaborating with other groups. And so what that means, if you look at every community like a little nation, like a little country, that means that every community needs to import and export with the other countries in order to really have like a thriving economy. And so if you take that analogy back to community currencies or to kind of small in-group commerce, any given currency like the hearts would have to be liquid to other currencies in order to really be effective. Because the moment, again, from a user experience point of view, the moment you kind of run into that first roadblock of, well, I've earned a lot of hearts, but the thing I want to buy is not available in hearts. I need dollars or shekels or stars, to buy that thing. Well, now how am I going to trade my hearts for that currency? Oh, I can't. Okay, the funnel breaks in that moment and my hearts are now worthless. They're like loyalty points or punch cards or, something very marginal that maybe I figure out how to use in some particular moment, but I don't think of them anymore like a currency. I don't think of it like money if I can't use it whenever or wherever I need. And that, of course, is one of the great things about what we call fiat currency, or our national currencies, our dollars and our euros and our yens and everything else, is that we have liquidity markets, global liquidity markets that allow us to use any currency anywhere. Of course, with a kind of declining purchasing power or growing purchasing power, depending on which currency, which brings us back to the politics and back to kind of macroeconomics. But in the case of the hearts, what we understood was that any hearts project, any community currency would, no matter how successful, would run into this problem. And you can even take a huge community currency like Ethereum, and see that same model that, until Ethereum became liquid, meaning you could easily trade it for other currencies, or you could easily transfer it back to dollars or euros or whatever you're using at home, its growth potential is limited. And of course, these things are a bit chicken and egg and they go hand in hand. But what we understood in 2016, and this was kind of, seeing Ethereum launch and seeing what could be built on that platform, essentially programmable tokens, what we understood was that liquidity in this new world could be programmed into the token itself. It could be a feature, essentially, of a cryptocurrency, that it is liquid, that it can be what we today call swapped, right, for other tokens. And so that's how the Bancor protocol was born, was a real need in a real community currency network, if you will. And then a real innovation in terms of how that would happen. The Bancor protocol, of course, is open source. It's heavily used in DeFi. It's essentially the kickoff to what we call DeFi, or decentralized finance, because without this very basic fundamental, or what's called a primitive, a crypto primitive, or a technical primitive, without this, none of the other layers work. You can't do loans, you can't do yield, you can't do farming, you can't really do anything if you can't inherently convert token A to token B in some predictable and permissionless and secure way. And so that kind of brings us to writing the white paper in 2016 and launching the BNT token in 2017 in sort of that wave of summer of 2017. And maybe I'll stop there to see kind of where folks would like me to take it onward.
Amazing. I mean, that was super inspiring, and really love, how you shared so well, this future of community currencies and this cooperative economy. Love to hear in terms of you kind of saw the future in 2012, where we are now. What do you think 2025, 2030 looks like, and how do we speed that up? Because, I think your explanation of how geopolitics connects so nicely with tokens, I think there's so much room for having community currencies and tokens, and the long tail of tokens really improve society. So I'd love to hear your thoughts there.
Yeah, so it's interesting because I think our vision is the same. It hasn't changed since 2010, 11, 12 when we were discovering these concepts. And by the way, we didn't by any means invent them. Community currencies and the thinking around community currencies have been along since the beginning of time. And then particularly, we were inspired by our mentor in the space, Bernard Lietaer. Who was the chairman of the Bancor Foundation until his passing in 2019. Highly recommend, and maybe we can circulate a link for those who are interested, but the work of Bernard Lietaer on the topic of community currencies is by far the most foundational in our development. And I think in the development of the space, he writes some incredible titles like The Future of Money, Money and Sustainability, Rethinking Money, really foundational texts that I highly recommend. And essentially, the vision is that a long tail of community currencies or user-generated currencies has the potential to represent orders of magnitude of value beyond just the value that today we know of or we manage to capture and represent in our national fiat currencies. So we are globally currently for a few hundreds of years now in a one currency per nation model. There's benefits to that, there's challenges with that. And the model that we see going forward is essentially one currency per community. And a nation is, of course, a community. And as long as a nation sees itself as such, will remain such. So the theory here is not either or, but it's both and. And with liquidity infrastructure like Bancor and other AMMs that have come since, all of these currencies can coexist and to the benefit of everyone. So it's kind of like you can think of user-generated video, didn't replace studio-created content, but it certainly impacted it. And certainly we live in a both and world. And there's things that are great about studio-created content, things that are great about user-generated content. And we see those things kind of finding a way to coexist and finding healthy equilibrium. So if we look forward, the currency world that we see is certainly a multi-currency world. Currencies of every kind, by the way, national, community. You can look at other axes like currencies that are interest-bearing versus currencies that are actually depreciating, what's called demurrage in finance, meaning kind of a negative tax on holding a currency. That's an incredible feature if what you want to encourage with your currency is velocity or kind of the movement of money from hand to hand. You're negatively incentivized to hoard or hold or pool currency if your currency is expiring as you hold it, right? That's like a great motivator to spend it, to invest it, to gift it, to pass it on. And so that's a version of currency that can be very effective for certain use cases. So this long tail of currency, look, it's already here. The fact that we can talk about BNT and Ether and Bitcoin and dollars and euros and shekels, as currencies that are out there, that are traded, that are used, is incredible and is, a result of this evolution that we are inspired by and that we are a part of moving towards a long tail of currency. That said, I can share the insight that, in 2012, we thought we'd see it by 2014, and in 2021, it's hard to say if we'll see it by 2020 or by 2030 or 24 years. I think the journey of the entrepreneur is often represents this struggle between the can be and the will be, and it's important certainly to keep your eyes on both. And all of that is a long-winded way of saying things take longer than you think, and things take longer than you'd like. But I think the important intuition for us and for many is persistence. Certainly, it will never come if we give up. and it will come much sooner if we persist. And that really has been the story of Bancor. And if I can kind of focus on where Bancor is today, which is, you know, very interesting in these chapters as you evolve ideas to concepts. One of the most important things that I've learned and that I think is significant for crypto and generally for change makers and movement makers is that the bridge has to be built from what exists to what will come. There isn't some magical moment where we go from A to B. There is a very hard fought, hard won, hard built bridge that gets built from A to B. And of course, any bridge needs to serve, you know, both sides that it's connecting, A and B, or now and the future. And so, you know, where we find Bancor today and where we find DeFi today is really, you know, a moment in time. Like 2017 was a moment in time for a lot of these initial projects like Bancor, like Gnosis, like Maker, you know, getting off the ground, and many others. It was certainly not a comprehensive list. And you kind of fast forward to 2021 and we have our new crop of projects that are, you know, fundamental, significant, growing. And where DeFi is today is really, you know, serving as this initial proof of concept to the financial system and financial institutions for how they can start crossing the bridge. But certainly where we see the bridge going, you know, that B, that future point, is far beyond finance as we know it today. And it's far beyond financial institutions, which are, of course, or financial players, be they traders, you know, or market makers, which are critical in this moment to kind of get where we're going. Certainly what I would like to see, you know, a resurgence of, and I think is very much happening, is a refocusing on individual community currencies. Now that we do have at least the beginnings of a liquidity infrastructure. So in the past, maybe 3-4 years, I found myself often, you know, giving honest advice to entrepreneurs that I think it's too early to do community currencies. That, you know, we did them in 2012 and they were amazing experiments and we learned a ton and many people benefited from that trial. But what we discovered is that the infrastructure isn't there for these to really succeed at scale, and that, you know, your energy might be better placed in building the infrastructure or in other things before attempting to launch these pilots in the real world. I think today we're back in a place where it's not only valid but essential that we really try to deploy these community currencies now that we've kind of solved or collectively solved for the challenge of not having a permissionless liquidity infrastructure. So that doesn't mean by any means that the liquidity infrastructure is done and that it, you know, it's complete and it's perfect. And again, that's where Bancor finds itself, you know, among its peers in DeFi, really like fine tuning what that means. What is a perfect or a better liquidity infrastructure? What is the right way to govern these protocols? What is the right way to incentivize and reward liquidity providers, yield farmers, etc., without sort of tipping the scales to where the liquidity infrastructure is being usurped, right, for capital gains. You need to find that balance where the capital gains are compelling enough to bring in the capital, which is essential to the shared liquidity infrastructure, without corrupting it. And this is one of, you know, the hardest problems, I think, in humankind, right, is like finding that kind of balance between progress and deterioration of the goal. And so I do think it's a good time to get back to work on community currencies. I think the liquidity infrastructure is good enough to at least not be a bottleneck. And that's the good news. And kind of the challenging news, or the hard news, which is where a point I alluded to earlier, is that community currencies take time to build and nurture. A community currency is not like necessarily a viral product, right? That goes out one day and the next day everyone's using it and it just works. A community currency is essentially a reflection of the collaborative potential and the collaborative energy of a community, which we know is, again, hard fought, hard won, hard built. And so my encouragement is definitely to return, and many folks are already there, to the community currency experimentation pilots, projects, and with a healthy amount of patience and planning, because it takes as long to build a community currency as it takes to build a community. And I think you guys, Michael and the unit team are very familiar with that. A community is not an event. A community is not a moment. A community is not a brand. A community is a collection of individuals, can be changing over time, but that persists in defining their shared goals, redefining their shared goals, and working towards and hopefully eventually achieving their shared goals, and then having new goals, right? A community is a living, breathing organism, like a human, that needs constant nurturing, constant food, constant, trajectory. And so again, it brings us back to kind of the, these things won't happen quickly or overnight, but certainly I think we're back to where it's really worth trying.
Amazing. And we have a nice question here from Yip. How does one differentiate the signal from the noise when looking at the varieties of different cryptocurrencies out there? What makes a project valuable? Where does the fundamental value come from?
So it's a good question. I can't pretend to have an official, the official answer on it. I think it's like, anything in life. How do you tell the good from the bad? A lot of it is, best practice and research, and then a lot of it is intuition, and kind of your inner voice or your connection to a project. Something that I think helps when analyzing is really looking to the founders, or at least whoever is kind of the engine behind the early creation, the early team, and asking why. Why are they doing this? And I've found that will quickly either yield a really great answer, or yield a really worrying answer, or a non-answer, which is also really worrying. And that is not financial advice. And I think that the jury is still out on whether the right projects, or let's say the well-intentioned projects, are also the lucrative ones, especially in today's environment, or the environment we come from. But I think that's kind of what we're all hoping to change and trying to change, right? Is that eventually there'll be a better kind of incentive alignment, that good projects will do well in the markets. I can tell you that, from the Bancor experience and from the early days through today, it's the right choice, or the well-intentioned choice is not always the most lucrative choice, so to speak, in a market or an environment where tokens float on markets, are very affected by PR, by marketing, by messaging. That's a challenge that we have as an industry, and that we also as an industry are not in control of it, right? There are a lot of external players to the industry that dictate how those movements play out. My personal take is kind of anything worth having is worth working hard for, and anything worth doing is worth doing right. So I gravitate certainly, and Bancor gravitates towards kind of the long game, which is building, fundamentally well-aligned products and infrastructure to get where we're going collectively, as opposed to where I personally might be going, or where our project specifically might be going. And this is something that comes up a lot when we look at Bancor and AMMs, and the AMM industry that's developed as a result of Bancor's innovation in 2017. And we have to tell ourselves, and we believe this fully, that the reason that we invented Bancor is so that a liquidity infrastructure could exist, so that a multi-currency world could exist. And that doesn't, in an open source environment, that doesn't, dictate that will exist through us, through others, through our work, through others' work. And so you really have to own that intentionality, right? That you want to see something happen, regardless, let's say, of your particular benefit in it happening, and that you are committed to that collective benefit that results from it happening, one way or another, hopefully in a well-intentioned way.
Amazing. That's such an incredible vision and insight there. Really quick question from Felix. I agree with the liquidity aspect challenge from a closed user group for a currency. You mentioned the swaps and new ways to create and ensure liquidity, but can you give us a bit of a background on how this works for those of us who are not DeFi experts? So how do you explain like an AMM or the long tail of tokens swapping against one another in a simple way, please?
Yeah, so I think, for non-DeFi folks, you can think of AMMs in a sense like automated exchange rates. So, the big problem in liquidity in general, or in pricing in general, is like, how do you know what the price of something should be? That's a hard question in and of itself. And then the next follow-on question is, how do you know what, once you have the price of something in a particular currency, what should its price be in a different currency, i.e., what is the price of one currency to another, right? And this is what we call exchange rate. So, the dollar is about 1.5-ish, I think, euros, or 3.5-ish shekels, or we have a tried and true framework for exchange rates. However, there are many problems with how exchange rates work today. One is kind of the technical problem, which is they're based on supply and demand, essentially how much people want them versus how much people are selling them, which can be a problematic way to price things. It can be very manipulated by PR, by politics, by scandals, by sentimental currents. And then, of course, there's kind of the mechanistic challenge, which is that you have to be basically the size of a nation in order to enter that game, where your currency will be priced, by others. Well, there'll be enough demand and supply for it that it will enter the exchange rate framework that we have. And so at Bancor, what we wanted to do was create a very transparent and automated way that one currency gets changed or exchanged or swapped for another currency. And so that's how the Bancor protocol was born. It's essentially a mathematical formula. It's open source. It's, you can find it anywhere. It doesn't change. It's immutable, which is one of the benefits of building a system like this on blockchain. And it's essentially a formula that kind of says how you would balance two buckets. In this case, two buckets of different currencies. And the way that you do that is by setting essentially a ratio, a parameter, and we call it the reserve ratio, but it's essentially like a balance between these two. And then whenever one is bought from here or sold from here, these buckets essentially get balanced, holding on to that ratio and changing the prices of the currencies, meaning changing the exchange rate. I've described it sometimes like a vending machine for currencies, where the vending machine has every currency to offer and accepts every currency as payment. And the thing that's changing all the time is the price that you see on the screen of, okay, well, I have token A and I want to buy some token B. And so the vending machine will tell me in an automated way how much that's going to cost me. What's the exchange rate between those two currencies. I hope that is helpful. That was just one part of the question, though, right? Do you want to repeat it for me?
I think you did it super well in terms of answering that question. Curious to hear, when we're successful, with the long tail of community currencies and tokens, and this fluidity of of tokens and currencies in the economy, like what do you think will emerge? Like, what is your motivation as to when this is successful? Like, what's going to arise in the world? What problems are going to be solved? How is it going to change people's lives positively?
Okay, great. So I just glance at the chat, and I see this question, could you explain why it's more predictable? So maybe I'll just end with that since we're on the technical side of the protocol, and then we'll go back to the kind of the bigger vision or the future vision. So the reason that an AMM, an automated market maker like Bancor, is more predictable is because that formula that I mentioned of how one currency relates to the other is public, is open source, is known, it's transparent, and it's not changeable. And so what that yields is what that leads to is what's called a bonding curve or price curve, which means you can know at any point along a curve, along a price movement, how much the price will be affected by a different transaction, by a different size transaction. So if I buy this much of the currency, it's going to cost me this much. But if I buy just this much, it's going to cost me this much. And so you get that's what leads to kind of the predictability. And predictability tends to also lead to lower volatility. One of the things that's tough about, let's say centralized exchanges, and certainly regular exchanges like pre-crypto, if we're talking about the stock market, or other markets, is that the price is established through an order book, which is like matching buyer and seller bids. It's not a predetermined price curve or graph. And so what you end up with there is, first of all, a lot of human manipulation, right? Like, I'll bid this, I'll bid that. And those bids don't necessarily pan out, and they create some erratic movements. And also, like, big advantages to market makers and folks that have enough capital to kind of execute on those orders. And so the permissionlessness of the new generation of AMMs, meaning anyone can add a token, anyone can provide liquidity, anyone can get their sort of pro rata fees for providing that liquidity, is not only more predictable in certain senses, but it's also much more inclusive. And the rewards to liquidity, if you will, are able to be shared much more widely. So I hope that that answers the question. And then, Michael, I'll go back to yours about, what's the end game, if you will, or the next game, or like, what does this look like down the road? And, again, you can think of currencies like content in a way, or like a collaboration software, like, an Asana, if you will, but being totally customizable per group and per outcome. And so what you get if you go all the way down that rabbit hole to, every single community has a currency, every single company has a currency, every single issue or project that we want to see in the world has a currency. In fact, every single person has a currency. So you can look at, things like BitClout, and we at Bancor did an experiment similar to it much earlier, again, called creator.eco, which was essentially meant to allow creators to create their own currency and use that currency with their fans to allow access to exclusive content and things like that. But if we go all the way to every person has a currency, right, this like infinite number of currencies, it essentially means much more customization, which hopefully yields to like a much better fit. So you can think of currency like the dollar or the euro as sort of these broad strokes, right? Like a big knife, if you will, to make a dinner with. But a community currency is like a scalpel. It lets you do things in a much more tailored way, specific way, look much more at like the specific externalities that are created, create much more affinity and loyalty, and ultimately much more trust. Because if you look at like big currencies like the dollar or the euro, essentially what they've come to do, and this is over like thousands of years that we've gotten here, they've come to help us with trust. Like, because you have a dollar and we all trust the dollar, let's say, I don't need to trust specifically the person I'm doing business with, because as long as they give me dollars, I'm good. And that's essentially the function of currency, or one of the functions of currency. And so we see how much that's helped us make progress and collaborate at scale, and build things like airports and airplanes and skyscrapers and iPhones and you name it. And on the other hand, we sort of have crossed this tipping point where in many ways these large currencies are corrupting trust, because they're such a stand-in for it that they've essentially removed our even attention and awareness to real trust. So now you can look at things like consumer protection, or yeah, you paid me in dollars, but I sold you a bad product, that's going to break. And community currencies really come in to sort of build trusted economics within specific groups, and help kind of rebalance. And again, it's not an either or, it's a both and so what we're aiming for with, similar with YouTube, right? What we're aiming for with millions of videos is not the next US dollar video. It's not the next, video that everyone's seen. It's something for everyone. It's something that everyone likes. It's everyone being able to find what they want. And at the same time, creators being able to, make a living, if you will, or, by offering their creation to maybe niche audiences that they otherwise wouldn't have been able to find. So it's like, we still have the kitchen knives, but we want these scalpels to be able to do sort of more precise economic collaboration with hopefully less collateral damage than the knives, seem to be creating, things that we call in economics externalities, like pollution, destruction of the commons, things like that.
Amazing. And what do you think is going to expedite this shift? Like, what's it going to take, for more creators to realize that they should issue tokens, for communities to start issuing tokens, for businesses to distribute some of their value created to their users and to their community, pretty much? Like what's it going to take? How can we, make it from 15 to 20 years to the next 5 to 7 years?
So it's a great question. And there's different answers depending on what part of the stack, one is operating at, if it's top down, bottom up, and also which part of the ecosystem, if it's within blockchain or kind of adjacent to blockchain. So I would say just on a personal level, like for every individual involved, understanding that currency is essentially a reflection or a stand-in for human collaboration means that it's a multidisciplinary endeavor. It's not finance, it's not technology, it's not social impact, it's everything together. And so I think that would serve individual creators in this space. If you're very, very deep on the technology, like the cryptography or something specific in that world, to branch out into monetary theory and ethics and things like that, and vice versa. If you're very long and deep on community engagement, community interaction, expose yourself to financial markets, trading dynamics, because you're going to launch your currency into that world. And you're going to need to understand how these different pieces fit together. So that's like on a personal level, I really advocate for a more just for kind of some comprehensive soul searching and how the whole puzzle fits together, or how more pieces of it. On a practical level, in order for these things to work, we're going to need everyone on board. So that includes regulators, that includes governments. So if those are areas that you're, have affinity to or affiliation with, I think education is critical, making sure the right people read the right books, so to speak, and at least get it or see the right videos or get exposed to some more comprehensive content on these topics, I think is critical. It takes one regulator in one country to say, yes, let's try this, or let's try this in this way, or let's sandbox this, and it's happening all around the world. But that's how we get the domino effect. So that's kind of broadly speaking. On the specific community currency side of things, I don't think necessarily what we need is more community currencies. So eventually, yes, but in order to get there, I think what we need is more well-functioning community currencies. So I would love, in my talks that I have with regulators and business leaders and industry leaders, to be able to show 5 examples of community currencies, not just that have been launched, but that have worked, over a couple of years, that are working, that are growing. I think that would be really helpful to make the case. And again, I said it a few times, but it takes a while to do that, and it takes it takes persistence and not relenting, because there are definitely challenges and setbacks along the way. But I think that the proof of concept is so important to be able to show how these currencies are ideated and then initiated and then nurtured, and certainly how they interoperate as well. But we probably don't go from very few community currencies to tons of community currencies interoperating. We probably go through some intermediary steps of community currencies interoperating with existing currencies. And now that we have such a strong liquidity base around Ether, around the Ethereum ecosystem, around other cryptocurrencies, I think it's enough at an intermediate stage that community currencies interact with other cryptos, because those cryptos are interacting with fiat, right? So you have that transference. But it's a very complicated question. It's like how do you make a movement, or how do you build a network, one node at a time, but balancing that with connecting between the nodes, of course.
Amazing. Thanks so much, Galia, for sharing this. Maybe a final question before wrapping up. Love to hear your personal dream, in terms of when this movement is successful, what's it going to create? What does what does that look like for yourself? What does that look like for the world? Please, thank you.
So I think a good way to say it succinctly is that we have a world that's driven by value rather than money. That money supports our quest for value, but doesn't become our quest, which I think is sort of an imbalance that we currently see, because the things that we actually want and yearn for, first of all, are very shared amongst us as a global community on a fundamental level. But secondly, are actually the things that we're trying to buy with the money that we make in many cases, right? And so if we can create a monetary system which, by its technology, by its incentive structure, by its regulation, where the rules of the game essentially are constantly asking us to build for value, to create value for others, value for the world, value for future generations. And the money is a supportive tool in doing that. It's essentially an indicator of, are we doing that or are we not doing that? It's not its own thing, or it's not so separate as it is today. So I think that's the dream, is that we have a financial and monetary system that is specifically designed for creating value with money, not money itself.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Galia. Really enjoyed your insights so much and thoughts, and I'm sure everyone else did.